Hey everyone, welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. We have a very special guest. As you can see, we're out of studio today, but this guest is so important. We had to do this podcast because I know from talking to folks, there's a lot of soldiers out there with questions about meals ready to eat, and we have the leading expert in all things combat feeding with us today, the division chief of combat feeding, Dr. Gaffney-Stomberg, joining us to answer all these burning questions that soldiers have had over the years. Dr. Stomberg, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, Colonel Behringer. It's really lovely to be here. I'm excited to be part of this podcast. I love the mission of what you're doing here, getting the facts out to our warfighters. So super excited to participate. I do feel like that was a very kind introduction. I don't know if I'm gonna, be the expert, but man, I lead a division of some really talented folks, and so I lean on them and their expertise, and hopefully I can do all their hard work justice today as I'm talking to you.
I'm sure you will. The first question I want to start off with is, you're a dietitian, just like me, except much more accomplished. But so, what made you become a dietitian? Kind of what's your story that got you into nutrition?
Oh yeah, gosh, that's a bit of a circuitous journey. So I'll try to speak to that in bullets. But early on in my academic career, I was drawn to math and sciences, and I was actually originally a business accounting major because, yeah, I enjoyed the analytical tasks. And I started going to school in Southern California my first year, and I did well. I enjoyed it, but I wasn't quite sure if that was my path. And I paid for college myself, and so wanted to be sure that my investment was absolutely something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I actually took a couple of years off. Worked for a bank. And it was actually during that time that I realized I wanted a career where I could help people in a more tangible way. So my favorite part of that job was actually helping customers and fellow tellers when they had a problem where their books weren't balancing. And so I actually went back to school as a biology major. I did that for 3 years. And again, just found myself in this crossroads of not sure what I wanted to do. I was thinking about the medical field initially, again, wanting to help people. But conventional medicine for me felt like a partial fix or kind of a cover of, chronic effects of day-to-day choices. And at the same time, a close family member was diagnosed with diabetes. And so I had this moment where I was in my room looking at my bookshelves, and fully 75 or 80% of the books that I chose to read on my downtime were about nutrition. And so I had, again, this aha moment of, hey, why don't I make this a career? And so I met with a career counselor at the university and, found out about the different options for a career in nutrition. And that's when I should say that I decided on a coordinated program in dietetics, where I could get a bachelor's in dietetics and do the 900 hours of supervised clinical practice on top of the coursework. And really the rest is history. I loved it immediately. I really enjoyed the preventative focus of good nutrition, but I also enjoyed the medical nutrition therapy aspects and, intellectually to understand how nutrients work in the body, at the cellular level. So I was really excited, to find a career that seemed to have so many options, within the nutrition space. And I had that analytical aspect. I felt like I was helping people. So that's kind of how I stumbled into the registered dietitian field.
Oh, that's awesome, and I'm so happy to hear your route because I was kind of similar. I actually started off a business major. I didn't do accounting, didn't want to do numbers, but yeah, I didn't go straight there. So that's awesome that based on your passion, right? You found this career. So I think that's a good lesson for soldiers, listening who maybe don't know what they want to do, post Army. Can you describe your current role of what you do now at Combat Feeding?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Combat Feeding's division's chief, which is a relatively new role for me. I accepted this role January 30th of this year. So yeah, so very new for me. But in that role, I lead a very diverse group of individuals that work within the division. So the division employs researchers, so scientists, engineers, food product developers, so food technologists, biologists, chemists, so very, very broad. But the mission of the division is really to have a secure research base. So we do research and engineering for the Joint Force in order to develop combat feeding solutions for the field. So we are a joint program, and so we actually have a board that oversees the execution of the program, and there's a voting member from each of the services on that board. And it's a really great way to do business, because each of those voting members bring up the concerns and needs and requirements of their service members to us. And so that's one of the ways that we can be responsive to our customers, that is the warfighter. So they'll bring those needs up to us. And then as division chief, I'm really responsible for making sure that that program gets executed, that the division is staffed in order to, fulfill that mission.
No, that's great. In one area, I do want to circle back about your background that I know, but I want the other people to know is, I mean, if I could think of the perfect, individual to be in that seat, it would be you, because previous to that, you worked at Usarium doing this sort of research that goes into MREs. Could you talk a little bit about that, what you did there?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I do feel like, so many experiences that I've been lucky to have, professionally, have really built me up to this place. So thank you for your kind words. That's very nice to say. Whenever you're new to something, it's like the fire hose, right? So you learn so much at once. But I've been in federal service now a little over 10 years. Initially started as a postdoctoral fellow in the nutrition division at Usarium, the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine. So, one of the many acronyms in the DoD. But in that role, it was actually really interesting. When I got that postdoc, I hadn't had a lot of experience, or any experience, I should say, in a military research lab. I came from an academic lab. And when I was interviewing for that position, the chief at the time there told me about the close partnership with a combat feeding division. And so as a researcher, I was so excited at the prospect of doing human physiological research, really defining nutrition requirements, and being able to transition that knowledge to a product developer that was co-located in post, which is combat feeding. And so, I think, those of you out there who've done research, understand that the application of your research many times might not even be apparent during your lifetime. And so as a government scientist, it was incredibly exciting to be able to do work that I would be able to see the application of during my lifetime. So I spent 7.5 years at Usarium doing that type of work. And so Usarium's mission really is left of the product development, if that makes sense. So really understanding the unique combinatorial stressors that warfighters face, how those affect their physiology and performance, and how they affect nutrient requirements, because our warfighters are absolutely unique. They don't always understand when and where the threat is coming, when they need to perform. And so their requirements are unique as compared to an athlete. And I think, many times people make that comparison, the warfighter or soldier athlete, and it's not the same thing, right? Because, our high level athletes have the luxury of training for their event. They know when the event is happening. They know exactly what the event is, right? Our warfighters don't have that luxury. And so, that physiological research base to understand those specific requirements is so important. So that is what Usarium does. There's others within the Department of Defense that do that as well. But I was at Usarium, so I guess that's why I know the most, about that particular mission. But so they'll really define those warfighter specific nutrient requirements, and then transition that information to combat feeding, where I am now. And we'll develop the material solutions, the food product, to meet those requirements. The other thing that combat feeding will do is develop interventions. So, you think about those nutrition research studies that Usarium does, they need to test whether or not a particular nutrition intervention has an effect on warfighter performance, right? And so the way to do that, the gold standard way, is through a randomized controlled trial. And the control part comes in with placebo, right? So you'll have your active nutrition intervention, and then you'll have the matching placebo. And combat feeding will develop those. So we'll match the placebo to the intervention and provide those to use cerium and other research laboratories that will do the tests to determine whether there's an effect on performance.
No, that's awesome. Again, I did want to capture that because, your background, as you were saying, to be left of those rations and now to be at those rations and understanding that whole process is just awesome to have somebody sitting in that seat who gets who's seen it all, really. With that being said, as we talk about the solution side, which you're on now, could you talk, a little bit about what goes into making a meals ready to eat? Because I don't know if the average warfighter truly appreciates what goes in to make those little brown packages they get.
Yeah. So great question. So with that said, even with my background, to the left of ration production, before I moved over to combat feeding, which was about 2.5 years ago, because I was initially a team lead, I didn't fully appreciate how much really goes into that. So I would say, if you're talking about the meal ready to eat or MRE, that's our standard individual operational ration. There's more than just the MRE when it comes to individual operats or operational rations. And there's also group rations as well. And so combat feeding does development for all of those. But to focus specifically on the MRE, there's really 3 main phases, if you will, of making an MRE. The initial phase is the development process, and that occurs at combat feeding. So that development process, we have food scientists or product developers that will do the development work. And so what goes into that, a lot of the work, or the challenge, I should say, really comes into play because of the shelf stability that's required for the MREs. And that stability is 3 years at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's a steep ask. And so there's a lot of food science that goes into that. So the product developers will test the shelf stability of a new product that they've developed. They'll look at nutrient retention. So the nutrition that's in that product before storage and after, is it still there? Also the palatability. So we have sensory panels that will taste the products, again, before storage, after storage. And there's an iterative process really to get that product where it needs to be so that it's shelf stable, the nutrients are retained, and it tastes good. Then from there, there's also the safety testing. So we have a biological laboratory that confirms that that product is safe to eat, that there's no, bacteria or, contamination. And also over the course of storage, right? You want to make sure that there's nothing growing. So we test the safety. And then finally, there's a scale up process. So, you start with a very small batch, if you will, like you're cooking in your own kitchen, right? So it's only going to feed a few people, but you want to know that you can scale up that production to produce many, many items at once. And so we'll do those scale up testing. So that's the development process. But then from there, there's a transition to what we call engineering and manufacturing. And that occurs actually at combat feeding as well. That's another side of our house, if you will. And so from there, they work with the industrial base to produce an even larger batch, if you will, of that new product. So while combat feeding does the development, once something is developed and transitioned to that engineering and manufacturing, it's actually produced by industrial kitchens within the country. So our engineering and manufacturing folks within combat feeding will work with those industrial partners, do that scale up, and then they'll take the product from that scale up and they'll do an initial operational test and evaluation with warfighters out in the field who are training the way they would fight. And the product developers or the engineering folks will do data collection. So they'll look at how much of the new product are the warfighters consuming. The warfighters will also fill out surveys. Do they like this item? If not, what is it about it that they don't like? So ultimately, nothing will get transitioned for production and insertion into the MRE ration unless it's warfighter tested and warfighter approved. And then finally, the third piece, and I know, I'm sorry, I'm saying a lot.
No, this is great.
Here. But the third piece is then the production. So once it's warfighter tested and approved, it gets then approved by the Joint Services Operational Ration Forum. So again, representative from each of the services has to say, yep, looks good, we approve this. And then it goes to the Defense Logistics Agency for contracting. So the Defense Logistics Agency, or DLA, will contract it to commercial ration producers. And then those ration producers still work with combat feeding, because we'll receive samples from those production lots. And we have trained sensory panelists that will confirm that those products meet the contract specifications. So there's that sort of surveillance process once something's been produced.
No, I appreciate you going into that detail because, again, I didn't fully appreciate it like you did until I spent some time up at Usarium and saw a little bit of that. But soldiers, we like to complain about chow. I've been there, I've done that. But I think when you understand the background, it does make you a little more appreciative as you, again, tear into that brown packet of goodness, at the end of a ruck march, to know what all happened in order to get that food to you. So thanks for that. Now, I know we talked specifically about MREs, but can you give us like a brief overview, because there are so many other rations that warfighters don't know about that you guys make. So could you talk a little bit about the other rations you make there?
Yeah, sure. So on the individual operational ration platform side, the meal ready to eat is the most common. And so I think that is why it's the most well known. But we also developed, I should say, the first strike ration. So the first strike ration is something that's designed to be eaten for the first 72 hours. So this is a no prep, lightweight, eat on the go kind of ration. Really, as warfighters are dropped into an area of conflict, they can bring this with them. Again, it's very lightweight. Another one is the meal cold weather, or MCW. And as its name implies, this is a special purpose ration. It's for extreme cold weather. It has long shelf life. It also has a lot of dehydrated components. And so that does require the melting of snow or ice to reconstitute those items. And then we have modular operational ration enhancement packs. We have 2 of those currently. One of them is for cold and high altitude, and then another one is for hot weather. And those are enhancement packs that can be added on top of any of the other individual ration platforms. We have a third modular operational ration enhancement pack that's actually in development right now, which is a performance pack. And that particular enhancement pack was requested by the Special Forces, but it's appropriate not only for the Special Forces, but for other units that are undergoing high physical intensity or physically demanding operations. And the way that pack is designed to be consumed is that there's 3 different categories of items. So one category would be for mission sets that are under 3 hours, and it has certain components to be consumed during that mission. So those components tend to be higher in carbohydrate and electrolyte. Then there's there's a second category for longer range missions, so more than 3 hours. And then the third category contains recovery items. And those items have high quality protein and the right carb to protein ratio, really to support recovery after that intense mission. So those are the individual operational rations. And then there's also group rations. And so there's 4 main types of group rations. The Unitized Group Ration Express, or UGRE. And this is also known as kitchen in a carton. And it's based on an 18 serving tray ration. It's shelf stable, ready to cook. And then we have something called the Unitized Group Ration Heat and Serve. This is kind of like the MRE equivalent of a group ration. So it's shelf stable, and it feeds 50. So there's 50 meal modules. And that's, again, just a heat and serve. And then we have the UGRA, or Unitized Group Ration A. And that's very similar to like restaurant style food. So it's a lot of fresh items. And so that's something that can be provided when there's a bit more infrastructure in the field, because it requires, a higher level type of field kitchen, that sort of thing. And then we have the Unitized Group Ration M, which is similar to the A, but it's for the Marines specifically.
Nice. That's great, and hopefully, folks listening to this can understand that those options are out there, because there's been sometimes even supply personnel, they don't know that these options are out there. And I love, like, I was a fan of the first strike, particularly I think it's the applesauce,
Yeah.
caffeinated applesauce. Where else in the world can you get caffeinated applesauce besides the first strike ration? So
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of those. So that's really exciting. Um, do you personally have a favorite MRE?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in my current job, I get kind of that front seat view of what's under development. And so I don't want to say that because people are going to say, "Hey, I can't I can't get that. Your favorite. I can't get it right now." Um, but so I am semi-vegetarian. So in terms of MREs, I lean more towards the vegetarian entrees. There's a couple of vegetarian menus in each of the cases. So that's kind of where I do lean. Like you, I like the first strike and some of the components there. I like the eat on the go aspects. Um, and then I guess we can talk a little bit about kind of the future of rations. But one of the things that we're working on now is a new ration platform. It's called the Close Combat Assault Ration, and this is something that really came out of the Close Combat Lethality Task Force, really thinking about the future, and that we may have small units that are in areas where resupply is difficult. And so, similar to the first strike ration, there's going to be a lot of kind of eat on the go items, but it will include probably one entree, that does require a little prep. But that particular ration platform is really relying on some new technology that we've identified from the industrial base and brought to the ration side, where we can make items as nutrient dense as possible and energy dense as possible to reduce the logistical footprint. So one of my favorite items is actually in that, not to, yeah, I know, not to kind of, tease people here, but there's actually a cheesecake that is produced using something called vacuum microwave drying. And so as the name implies, it's a vacuum and a microwave together. But the heat that's applied to VMD products is not as high as like a retort, which is like a canning process. And so you get really good nutrient retention, and you can actually dial in specifically how dry you want the item to be. And so for the cheesecake, you wouldn't want a crunchy, dry cheesecake that's like astronaut ice cream, right? So it's a little bit chewy, and actually the crust is in the middle, but it's very tasty. And that is actually going to be going into the MRE in the future as well. It was just approved by the Joint Services Operational Ration Forum to go into the MRE. So
That's exciting. So you heard it here, folks. Look for cheesecake. In the future. I mean, what better way? You just got done with a hard ruck. You're dropping, you're taking a knee, you're getting some water, and you can have some cheesecake. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Um, Another question, get asked a lot is how long are soldiers meant to eat MREs?
yeah, so that's a great question. So there's actually very specific guidance on that that came out of earlier research done by Usarium, actually. So the guidance is 21 days. And the reason for that, it's not that the MREs are not nutritionally complete, because they are. So our menus are actually reviewed by higher level dietitians, right, within the Department of Defense, and signed off on, to make sure that the menus meet something called the nutritional standards for operational rations, or NSORs. Again, another acronym. But while the MREs are nutritionally complete, what does happen, or what the studies found, was that after 21 days, there is some kind of fatigue in terms of seeing the same foods over and over. And so intake does start to decline, just because people get, bored with the same thing. When that study was done, I think there was less variety in the MREs than there is today. So, I don't know if the, 21 days is still fully accurate, but that is the guideline that we have. It's interesting because there's another Usarium study that was published a couple of years ago that Combat Feeding collaborated on, looking at a little bit more careful details of performance, if that makes sense. So those older studies really looked at energy intake. and they looked at body weight and some other things. But the study that was done by Usarium and published a couple years ago looked at changes to the microbiome, changes to intestinal permeability, nutrient status, and again, found that 21 days was just fine. They didn't go past that. But yeah, so 21 days to answer your question.
21 days. So everybody understands that.
Yeah.
21 days. Although you could go longer, and sometimes with the MRE, with the fatigue, I just think they're not hungry enough, because I could tell you, and maybe a few of my fellow Ranger School graduates who might be listening, they still were delicious all the way through, and that was 60 days. I was just really hungry. I was always excited about MREs. So I guess it just depends on that hunger scale, maybe, how you view it. Another kind of question I get a lot, or something that's kind of out there in the universe, is the MRE gum really a laxative? That's what I hear, that the gum is a laxative. True or false?
I feel like this is the military equivalent to an urban rumor.
Yes.
So false. The MRE gum is not a laxative.
All right. Hopefully you put that to bed. Young soldiers, young NCOs listening to this. The MRE gum is not a laxative. Okay. Nope. Just gum, just regular gum.
Yep,
thanks for that. Another one, the calories in the MRE. I know that information is readily available. People can see it, but still, I hear wild numbers thrown out there. Can you also kind of, talk about the average calorie in MRE?
Yeah, great question. I mean, these are things that I think that anybody would want to know, right? So for the MRE, one MRE, which is one package, that there's multiple components in that MRE, right? You've got your entree, side item. So one MRE is just over 1,200 calories. And the guidance is to meet requirements is 3 MREs a day. So that's a little over 3,600 calories. And so again, when you look at the guidelines, the nutritional standards for operational rations, it's 3,600 calories per day. So, I mean, that brings up I guess a separate point, and I'm sure, something that you think about as a dietitian as well, which is that, there is no one size fits all solution, right? So, when you're looking at providing nutrition, at this level, right, where you've got to provide it to, large units all at once, MREs are also used for humanitarian aid, right, and disaster relief. And so you need to have a guideline somewhere. You need a hard number. And so that 3,600 is there. It takes into account the average body weight of men and women, and and then when it looks at micronutrients, it looks at what is the highest requirement. So if there's a difference between men and women, then the higher requirement is what would be in there. But we know that actual nutrition requirements, certainly from the standpoint of energy and macronutrients, are individual. They really are dependent on somebody's body weight, their activity level, their age, all of those things. So there is education out there for warfighters to help them determine what their requirements are. And there's some suggestions for how to smartly field strip your MRE, right, to meet your own needs. And so there's something called the Performance Guide, or Warfighter's Guide to Performance Nutrition with Operational Rations. And so that can teach you what is based on your body weight, again, and your activity, what is your actual, nutrition requirement.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll put a link to that guide, because that's another thing that I don't know if folks know, that hey, there's a guide out there on how to optimally use your MREs for performance. No, thank you so much for that. And you mentioned the micros and macros. Now who's determining those for the MRE?
Yeah, so that's not combat feeding, right? So that's outside of our house, and then we follow the requirements, which I think is a really important point, that we're not kind of self-policing, if that makes sense, right? So so there's a regulation. So in the Army, the regulation is 40-25, and it's called Nutrition and Menu Standards for Human Performance Optimization. And so that document is something that is vetted through the DoD Nutrition Committee, which is a committee that includes representation from across the DoD nutrition landscape. And so this document gets updated, every every so many years. And the new science that comes from Usarium and others is actually reviewed and then compared to this document, and then it's updated for warfighter specific nutrition requirements. At the base, it starts with the dietary reference intakes, for Americans or the DRIs, and then layers on top of that the results of studies that are conducted specifically in warfighters. And so that's where you would take the specific sort of civilian requirement and then change it where the evidence indicates that warfighters are unique. And so again, all of that is gone through with the committee, and then signed off. And we at Combat Feeding need to follow that guideline when we're developing MRE menus and other operational ration menus.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you spoke about that. Funny enough, my students here, we just had Dr. James McClung. He covered a little bit of that. What was it, on Tuesday? So
Great.
For any of my students who might be listening, this all should hopefully be ringing bells, and you should understand this process. You'll be tested on it later. So you talked about these taste panels. Yeah. Is there anything else that goes in? How does Combat Feeding kind of come up with the flavor of the MRE? Do you guys, sit around a table and taste things initially? Like, how does that flavor determination kind of come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few things that go into it. So one of those is really looking at consumer trends, right? So what types of flavor profiles are people interested in? So that's, more broadly when we're talking about just even initiating a new product. But then from there, we actually do consumer panels. So there's two different types of sensory panels. So the consumer panels are where, soldiers that are stationed in Natick or civilians or, others that are just your typical consumer can come and taste something and say, I like this or I don't like that. And then we have a different type of panel that are trained sensory analysts. And for that, the very first step is to make sure that people have good taste buds. So, there is a genetic component to how well people taste. And so
it's like a sommelier or whatever for MREs.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Yeah. So you first need to, start with somebody who genetically has a great ability to tease out flavors, in particular things like bitter and sour. Those can get confused if you don't have like a very good palate. So that's step one. And then those trained analysts have to go through, it's like 50 hours plus of training. And then they're compared to each other. So there's like this periodic calibration to make sure that everybody's tasting things the same. But to back up, when we're first starting a new product, it's really the consumer driving that. And then the trained sensory panelists are really the ones that can determine impacts of shelf stability or shelf storage, I should say. So they can pick up like the littlest notes of fat oxidation or other things that are indicating that a product is going bad. Not necessarily from a safety standpoint, but certainly from an acceptability standpoint. So in terms of consumer panels, one recent example of that is the Performance Readiness Bar, which is a product that came out of collaborative work between Usarium and Combat Feeding, a handful of years ago now. That's a calcium and vitamin D enhanced energy bar that's provided during initial entry training in the Army. So that bar up until actually currently, it's going through contracting. So let me step back. So currently that bar is offered every day through initial entry training in chocolate variety only. So we've got one flavor. And, while I love chocolate, I think it can get old even for a chocolate lover if you're being offered that exact same bar day in, day out for 10 weeks, right? So Combat Feeding worked with a panel of soldiers, of warfighters, and we provided them 6 different new flavors. So in addition to the chocolate, we had them taste a bunch of other flavors. And then from there, we down selected to their 2 favorites. So now, in addition to the chocolate, the trainees can anticipate seeing cherry berry coming forward and salted caramel. So 2 new flavors. So again, these were warfighter selected flavors from 6 different options. Those were the top 2 that will be coming.
Wow. So getting flavors. See, and again, this is great because soldiers don't appreciate all the thought from these trained test tasters, to determine all these factors, to being considerate of, hey, we have a product, but we know it's just in one flavor. Now we need to develop other flavors to give variety. No, I'm glad you're capturing that. Can we talk about, what do you see kind of if you're looking into a nutritional crystal ball? What's the future of combat feeding? What do you think it'll look like in 20 years? Kind of like what's on the horizon?
Yeah, another great question. It's really exciting to think about those things, right? I know no one has a crystal ball, but you can kind of anticipate where things are going and imagine what it might look like, right? So I think a big piece that will be impacting, combat feeding's mission and the way we're doing business is just the Army modernization and the needs of, the Army in 2030 and 2040 and beyond. And so what I mean by that is really the concept of operations for our forces is going to basically drive how we at Combat Feeding need to respond with food technology. So when you start thinking about, small units or dispersed operations and things like that, not only is it, lower logistics footprint, so reduction in load, so smaller, lighter, nutrition, there's the potential for even, producing nutrition at the point of need or at that point of consumption. So I can envision, the future being that, we've got some combination where you've got these, lightweight, low volume rations, but then maybe you've got some technology that actually allows you to harvest items from the atmosphere in order to produce safe nutrition. I
Wow.
know it's kind of far out to think that way, but there's already programs in other branches of the government that are working on those types of technologies, and they'll transition to combat feeding in the future for further development. So it's kind of cool to think about. And it'll be interesting to see, 20 years from now, if we look back at this, is that actually what happens? But yeah, there's always, with the changes in the way, wars will be fought potentially in the future, that really is a challenge to us in the science and technology fields to really be innovative, and to figure out the solutions that meet the needs of our warfighters. And so there's always, always some new challenge really to meet and figure out. So it's pretty exciting stuff.
No, that is just to think, kind of, 3D printing food on the battlefield, that would be very exciting. Um, is there anything that we've talked a lot about, things for combat feeding, and I know folks have learned a lot. Is there anything else you want folks to know about combat feeding that maybe you don't think gets out there, or they might not know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one thing when you're thinking about maybe myths, different myths that might be out there, when you think about the shelf stability, that the rations are required to have, I think that it's easy for people's brains to immediately think, oh my gosh, they must be full of so many preservatives and chemicals. And I thought that as well. I just assumed, like, well, how do you get shelf stability without putting a bunch of junk, right, in the
Hmm.
food? But the reality of the situation is that there's a lot of different parameters that you can change when you're developing food that don't involve chemicals and preservatives. And that's the approach that combat feeding really takes. And it's something called hurdle technology, like you're jumping over a hurdle, right? So you're
Cool.
racing and you're jumping over. So what that is basically using a small amount of each of the different factors that can improve shelf stability, so that you together you get a better result. And so what I mean by that specifically is there's something called water activity in food. So in order for bacteria to grow, they need a certain level of moisture. So you can play with the moisture level of the food. Another factor would be the pH, how acidic or how basic something is. You can play with the pH. That impacts the stability. Pasteurization. So, again, exposure to high heat, you can play with that. The challenge there is if it's too high heat for too long, you reduce the nutrient content. So again, can we use just a little bit, shorter time, but then, affect the water activity and the pH. And then a big piece of it is the packaging. So for those of you who are familiar with the MREs, the package is pretty thick. And in the middle, it's a tri-laminate or kind of 3-layer packaging. In the middle is a foil layer. And that foil is really effective at blocking out oxygen and moisture. And so a big piece of the shelf stability of the food comes from the package itself. And then there's also, if you have something like a dried cereal or like a trail mix, something that's not like a really moist food, or like an energy bar, we'll put in a little sachet of like an oxygen scavenger that you don't eat, right? It's just in there. And that's another way, again, to keep the shelf stability. And so the absolute last resort is ever to put in preservatives. And so we will only use those very sparingly when those other approaches or some combination don't work well.
No, thank you for that. Because again, yeah, I think that's out there. There's like, oh, it's full of preservatives and all this junk. But then to understand, no, you're taking this kind of holistic approach to food preservation. No, that's awesome. Where can folks, learn about combat feeding? If a soldier's listening to this, they're like, hey, I want to know more about this process or this organization. Is there a location, a one-stop shop they can go to?
Yeah, I can send you a link, but
Okay.
they can do a search for the Combat Capabilities Development Command Soldier Center, or DevCom Soldier Center, and that is the center where we're located in Natick, Massachusetts. And so the division is part of the sustainment directorate that's part of DevCom Soldier Center. So on our website, you can learn a little bit about it, and I can also share some links from our PAO, because they also will, post on their Twitter account or on their Facebook account updates that include some updates from combat feeding.
No, that's awesome. I like following those as well. And then lastly, just kind of since you read all those nutrition books on your shelf, do you have any book recommendations for the audience?
Oh gosh.
Doesn't have to be nutrition. It can be. I've had all sorts of different ones.
Yeah. So, well, I'm gonna mention one actually to kind of pull on something you mentioned, Colonel Behringer, a few minutes ago when you were talking about 3D printing of food, right?
Mhm.
So, Combat Feeding does have a lab that does that, and we recently were, or it was 3 years ago now, right? So I guess recent is a relative term, but we were interviewed for a book that's called The Fate of Food by Amanda Little. And there's a whole chapter that talks about the 3D printing, and basically this book talks about all of the different entities that really will be drivers in what the future of food looks like. And so, for those who might want to think a little bit more sci-fi or big picture about, about food in the future, that might be an interesting book.
No, thank you for that. The Fate of Food. I like that. I can't wait to check that out. That sounds like fun. I really just ask these recommendations, so I go out and get the books. But no, thanks. I'm
Yeah,
sure some.
do you have any recommendations for me? I feel like I should ask the question the other way around.
Well, the dietitian for the Spurs recommended Impact Players, which is sitting over here. So far, so good. I haven't finished it yet. I'm getting through it, but yeah, Impact Players by Liz Wiseman. So it's
I'm
a
gonna add that to my list as well. I'm
yeah.
looking for good books.
Yeah, no. Hey, Dr. Gaffney-Stomberg, thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you're extremely busy. So much great information shared. I'm going to go back and listen to it again because it's I learned things and I worked at USARIUM for a few years, so I know soldiers got a lot out of this. And then on behalf of all the soldiers, I want to say thank you for to you and all the folks at Combat Feeding for what you do, because I know, anytime in food preparation, you just get the complaints a lot of times. People, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And I want to say, I think the MREs are delicious. I've enjoyed many of them on different occasion at, austere locations. And I appreciate for, what they're being asked to do, how well they do it. So thank you for your professionalism and your service and all the folks at Combat Feeding.
Yeah, Colonel Behringer, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this opportunity, and thank you to your listeners as well. You all are why we have a job, and we love what we do because we love our warfighters, and really it's an honor to be able to be in this position and to serve those who are serving our country. So really appreciate it. So thank you to you for your service, and to the listeners as well. We have a job because of you, and we're here to help you, and really feel lucky to be able to do that. So thank you so much.